A bitter winter night, a desperate cry in the snow. When Ethan Walker opened his cabin door, he expected silence. But instead, he found a starving bobcat kitten, trembling on his porch. Would you risk everything to save a wild predator? Watch this incredible true story unfold. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly, blanketed in white under the biting cold of late October. The sky was an endless expanse of gray, promising an early winter. Deep in the woods, in a secluded log cabin nestled between towering pine trees, Ethan Walker stirred from his sleep to the familiar sound of wind howling against the wooden walls. He had lived here for nearly 3 years, long enough to know the rhythms of the land but not long enough to forget the life he left behind. A former wildlife photographer, Ethan once traveled the world capturing rare and untamed beauty. But after losing his wife, Claire, to cancer, the bustling city became unbearable. Memories lurked in every shadow, every familiar street corner. So he did what many grieving souls do, he ran. Montana was supposed to be his escape. Here, there were no painful reminders, no sympathetic glances. Just the silence of the wild and the occasional company of the creatures he once only observed through a camera lens. This morning, like many before it, began with black coffee and the quiet hum of solitude. Ethan wrapped his hands around the warm mug, staring out through the frost-covered window. The trees stood tall, dusted with the first signs of an approaching storm. Then he heard it, a sound so faint, it almost blended with the wind. A cry. He frowned, setting his mug down. It wasn't the call of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. It was small, fragile, almost pleading. Curiosity tugged at him, but experience kept him cautious. The wilderness was harsh, and survival was a brutal game. He had seen what happened to the weak and injured. Nature had its rules, and humans were not meant to interfere. Still, the sound persisted. Ethan grabbed his coat and stepped onto the porch. The cold bit at his skin instantly, sharp and unforgiving. The cry came again, closer this time. He scanned the treeline, eyes adjusting to the dim morning light. Then he saw it. A tiny figure just at the edge of his porch, barely more than a shivering lump of fur. Kitten, no, not a kitten. His pulse quickened. Even in its frail state, he could recognize the distinct spotted coat and tufted ears. A bobcat. The creature was small, too small to be alone. Its fur was ruffled, damp with morning frost, and its ribs pressed against its thin body. Weak, hungry, desperate. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen. His rational mind screamed at him to step back inside. This wasn't his problem. Predators belonged in the wild, and the wild did not need his help. But then the bobcat lifted its head and locked eyes with him. Pale blue-gray eyes, clouded with the innocence of youth but filled with something else. Trust. Ethan's chest tightened. Damn it. With a reluctant sigh, he turned back inside, reaching for the fresh trout he had caught the day before. He hesitated one last time, then stepped out, placing a small piece of fish just beyond the threshold of his door. The bobcat flinched but didn't run. Its nose twitched at the scent of food, and after a moment of hesitation, it stumbled forward on unsteady legs. Ethan held his breath as the wild creature devoured the offering. When it was gone, the bobcat looked up at him again, those strange, piercing eyes seeming almost grateful. Then, as quickly as it had come, it disappeared back into the trees. Ethan exhaled. That should have been the end of it. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The next morning, Ethan woke before dawn, as was his habit. The storm had not yet arrived, but the air carried a stillness, the kind that came before the first true snowfall of the season. He stepped outside with his coffee, his breath forming misty clouds in the freezing air. Everything was as it should be. The same quiet, the same trees, the same endless sky. Except for one thing. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond his porch, a shadow moved. Ethan froze. Not one shadow, several. His heartbeat kicked up as his eyes adjusted to the dim morning light. The bobcat was back, and it wasn't alone. Standing at the treeline was a full-grown female bobcat, Dakota. Her golden eyes studied him with fierce intelligence, her muscular body tense, ready to fight or flee. And beside her, 6 more kittens. Ethan's grip tightened around his coffee mug. The small bobcat from yesterday was among them, peeking out from behind its mother's legs, less fearful than its siblings. Dakota didn't move. She simply watched, and Ethan realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had unknowingly invited an entire wild family to his doorstep. Ethan stood frozen on his porch, his breath coming out in small clouds against the crisp morning air. His mind raced. He had expected the small bobcat kitten to return, maybe to scavenge for more food. But an entire family? That was something else entirely. Dakota, the mother bobcat, stood motionless at the edge of the clearing. Her powerful shoulders tensed beneath her thick winter coat, her ears pricked forward in cautious alertness. She was magnificent, a creature of pure instinct, built for survival in the harsh wilderness. Her golden eyes flicked between Ethan and the cabin, calculating. Beside her, 6 kittens clung close, their spotted coats barely distinguishable from the frost-covered underbrush. Ethan's heartbeat slowed as the weight of the situation settled in. He had unknowingly invited an apex predator to his doorstep. He swallowed hard. What now? Neither he nor Dakota moved. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Ethan wasn't stupid. He knew better than to make any sudden movements. Dakota was watching him, reading his body language. Any sign of aggression and she'd either flee or attack. The smaller bobcat, the one he had fed the day before, took a hesitant step forward. The kitten, Scout, as Ethan found himself calling it, peered up at him, ears flicking forward, tail twitching with curiosity. Dakota let out a low, guttural chuff, a sound that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It wasn't a growl, not quite a warning, but a reminder that she was watching. Scout hesitated, then took another step. Ethan's fingers instinctively curled around the coffee mug in his hand. The rest of the kittens remained clustered near their mother's legs, their small bodies trembling slightly in the cold morning air. He could see it in the way their eyes darted toward him, toward the cabin, toward the spot where Scout had eaten yesterday. That realization hit Ethan harder than he expected. It wasn't just that they were here. They had come back because they expected something from him. Ethan took a slow step backward, retreating into the warmth of his cabin. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the choice before him. He had broken an unspoken rule the moment he fed Scout, and now Dakota was here to collect. He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his unkempt hair. What was the right move? If he fed them again, would they keep coming back? Would they lose their natural instincts? If he didn't, would they starve? His gut twisted. They weren't domesticated animals. They weren't pets. They were wild. And wild things were meant to fend for themselves. But looking at Scout, at those blue-gray eyes filled with trust, he felt the same pull as yesterday. Damn it. Ethan grabbed a second fillet of trout from his fridge. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping back onto the porch. Dakota's ears flicked forward. The kittens tensed. Ethan moved slowly, deliberately, as he crouched near the same spot he had placed the fish before. He didn't throw it. He didn't make sudden gestures. Instead, he set it down gently in the snow, and then he stepped back. The moment stretched. Dakota's tail flicked once. Then, in a single fluid movement, she stepped forward, her muscles moving with the quiet grace of a trained hunter. Ethan held his breath as she closed the distance, lowering her massive head to sniff the offering. Then, without breaking eye contact with him, she picked it up. She didn't eat it. Instead, she turned and walked back to her kittens. And Ethan realized she hadn't come here for herself. She had come for them. The next few days followed the same quiet pattern. Each morning, Dakota and her kittens arrived. Each morning, Ethan left a small amount of food, just enough to help, but not enough to make them dependent. And each morning, Dakota took it, never approaching too close, never begging, never acting like a creature that had forgotten the wild. But something was changing. The kittens grew bolder. Scout, especially. While the others hung back, staying close to their mother, Scout crept closer each day, sometimes coming right up to Ethan's porch, peeking inside the cabin windows with fearless curiosity. Ethan found himself watching them more than he liked to admit. He photographed them, capturing moments of their life that few humans had ever seen. A mother teaching her young to stalk, kittens tumbling over each other in playful mock battles, and every once in a while, Dakota watching him with those piercing golden eyes. It was a strange kind of trust. But trust, Ethan knew, was a dangerous thing, because trust meant attachment. And attachment in the wild could be deadly. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan spotted something in the snow near his cabin. Footprints, but not from bobcats. They were human, and they weren't his. His stomach clenched. Someone else had been here. His mind jumped to the only logical explanation: poachers. Ethan scanned the treeline, his senses on high alert. The wilderness had its own rules, and some men were more dangerous than any predator. He turned back to the clearing where Dakota and her kittens had played just hours before. For the first time since this strange bond had begun, a new thought crept into Ethan's mind. It wasn't just about whether or not he should be feeding them. It was about whether or not he could protect them, and whether he even should. Ethan barely slept that night. The image of those footprints in the snow wouldn't leave his mind. He lay awake in his cabin, staring at the dark wooden ceiling, the wind howling outside. He had come to Montana for solitude, to escape the noise of civilization. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt something else creeping into his life. Someone had been near his property. Someone who shouldn't have been. At dawn, Ethan dressed in heavy layers and stepped outside. The cold bit into his skin, but he barely noticed. He went straight to where he had seen the tracks the evening before. They were still there, fresh, distinct, leading from the treeline toward his clearing, circling near where the bobcats had played. And then, they disappeared back into the woods. His gut twisted. He knew what this meant. Poachers. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had no love for them. Men who didn't respect the wilderness, who saw animals as trophies instead of living creatures. He had seen their work before. Once on the plains of Africa, photographing endangered rhinos, and again in the depths of the Amazon, where rare jaguars were slaughtered for their pelts. But this was his land. And now his bobcats. The realization startled him. They weren't his, of course. They were wild. They belonged to no one but the forest itself. But something deep inside him bristled at the thought of them being hunted. He had let them come to his land. He had fed them, and in some way he had made himself responsible. Determined to find out just how much danger Dakota and her kittens were in, Ethan grabbed his rifle and followed the tracks into the woods. He moved carefully, his steps silent over the frozen ground. The deeper he went, the more uneasy he felt. Then, after 20 minutes of walking, he found it. A trap. It was a steel-jawed monstrosity, half buried in the snow, its teeth gaping open like the maw of some cruel beast. Ethan felt a wave of disgust. He had seen these before. Illegal in most states, but that never stopped the worst kinds of hunters. The worst part? The snow was disturbed around it, as if something had struggled. A horrible thought hit him. Was he too late? The sound that froze his blood. Then he heard it. A cry, low, pained, barely audible over the whisper of the wind. Ethan's stomach clenched. He gripped his rifle and moved fast, following the sound. Pushing past low-hanging branches, he emerged into a small clearing, and his heart stopped. Dakota was there, and she was caught. A mother's fight. The steel trap had her rear leg pinned. The sharp metal teeth sunk deep into her flesh. Blood stained the snow around her. Ethan's breath came in ragged bursts. He had seen animals caught in traps before, but never like this. Dakota wasn't just injured. She was furious. Her powerful body thrashed, her teeth bared in a vicious snarl. She clawed at the snow, trying to free herself, but every movement only made the wound worse. And standing a few feet away, her kittens. They were huddled together, terrified, confused. Scout took a trembling step toward his mother, letting out a soft, pitiful mewl. Ethan swallowed hard. His instincts screamed at him to help, but another voice whispered, "If you get too close, she will kill you." Even in pain, Dakota was still a wild predator. A wounded animal was unpredictable. A wounded mother was even worse. The choice. Ethan felt his pulse hammering in his ears. He had two options. Option 1, walk away. Let nature take its course. It was brutal, but maybe the only right choice. Option 2, get close, risk his life, and try to free her. His fingers tightened around his rifle. Then Scout let out another cry. That did it. Ethan moved. The rescue. He threw his rifle over his shoulder and grabbed his heavy wool coat. Dakota's head snapped toward him, her eyes blazing with fury. "Easy," Ethan murmured. "I'm not here to hurt you." She let out a low warning growl. Every instinct told him to run, but instead he took another step closer. Then another. Dakota's tail flicked in agitation. Her ears flattened. Ethan's heart pounded. One wrong move and she would tear him apart. The moment of trust. With slow, careful movements, Ethan raised the coat in both hands and threw it over her head. Dakota snarled and thrashed, but the thick wool muffled her vision.
Ethan acted fast.
He dropped to his knees beside the trap, his fingers working quickly to pry open the steel jaws. Blood soaked his gloves. Dakota let out another deep, guttural growl. And then, snap, the trap sprang open. Freedom. Dakota lunged backward, shaking off the coat, her golden eyes locking onto Ethan. For a long, frozen moment, they stared at each other. Ethan didn't move. The kittens didn't move. Then, Dakota did something he didn't expect. She didn't attack. Instead, she took a staggering step back. Then another. She was free. Without another glance at Ethan, she turned and limped toward her kittens. They rushed to her, nuzzling against her bloodied fur. Ethan felt a strange lump in his throat. Had she understood? Did she know he had helped? The aftermath. Ethan backed away, giving them space. But as he did, he made himself a silent promise. Whoever set this trap, they would pay. He cast one last glance at Dakota and her family before turning back toward his cabin. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Ethan barely felt the cold as he trudged back to his cabin, his mind replaying every moment of the past hour. Dakota had been trapped, bleeding, helpless. He had freed her, and yet she hadn't attacked. That was what stuck with him the most. A wounded predator should have lunged the second she was free. Instead, she had looked at him, then limped away without a sound. It wasn't gratitude. Wild animals didn't feel that the way humans did. But maybe, just maybe, she had understood that he wasn't a threat. He slammed the door behind him and ripped off his blood-stained gloves, tossing them onto the wooden counter. His hands were still shaking. He needed to process what had just happened, but his instincts wouldn't let him relax. Someone had set that trap. Someone who didn't care that it was illegal. And if there was one, there were more. Ethan grabbed his rifle and a flashlight, shoving an extra magazine into his coat pocket before stepping back outside. His breath came in short bursts as he followed the tracks again, this time pushing deeper into the woods. Every few minutes, he found another trap. Some were empty, waiting for their next victim. Others held frozen corpses. Rabbits, a fox, even a coyote, all long dead, their bodies stiff with frost. He clenched his jaw, his anger rising with each discovery. This wasn't hunting. This was slaughter. Then he found what he was looking for. A makeshift camp sat just beyond the ridge, hidden beneath a cluster of pine trees. A small, half-collapsed tent, a rusted-out truck with its hood propped open, a pile of discarded beer cans, and scattered around the clearing, stacked like firewood, were animal pelts. Ethan felt his stomach twist. A movement near the tent made him go still. Then, a man stepped out, stretching, yawning, oblivious to the fact that he was being watched. Tall, broad shoulders, wearing a heavy camouflage jacket. The kind of man who thought he owned the land just because he had a gun. Ethan had seen his type before. The man pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, lighting one with slow, practiced ease. That's when Ethan saw it, the rifle leaning against the truck. And next to it, a second trap still smeared with fresh blood. Dakota's blood. Ethan's vision narrowed. His fingers tightened around his own rifle. He could end this right now. One shot and no more animals would die in those traps. His pulse pounded in his ears as he raised the scope to his eye, lining up the crosshairs with the man's chest. And then he stopped. What was he doing? Killing a man wouldn't change anything. There would always be more like him. The only way to stop this was to expose it. Ethan lowered the rifle, exhaling slowly. He needed proof. He pulled out his phone, snapping quick photos, the traps, the pelts, the man himself. Then he turned, moving silently back toward his cabin. He'd send the evidence to the game wardens. Let them handle it. But just as he reached the edge of the clearing, his boot snapped a twig. The man's head whipped around. "Hey!" Ethan ran. He sprinted through the trees, heart hammering as he heard the man crashing after him. A gunshot split the air, the bullet punching through a nearby tree trunk. Splinters exploded around him, but he didn't stop. He pushed harder, faster, until he broke through the trees and onto his property. The second shot never came. Ethan spun, panting, but the man hadn't followed him past the tree-line. Instead, he stood at the edge of the woods, rifle at his side, watching. A smirk curled his lips. "Bad idea, buddy," he called out. Then he turned and disappeared into the forest. Ethan didn't move for a long time. His chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths. That had been a warning shot. Next time, it wouldn't be. Finally, he staggered back into his cabin, bolting the door behind him. His hands shook as he grabbed his phone and pulled up the photos. He sent them to the Montana Wildlife Enforcement Hotline with a short message. Illegal trapping. Armed suspect. Location attached. Then he set the phone down and pressed his palms against the counter, trying to steady himself. A low, familiar sound made him turn. Scout sat outside the window watching him. Ethan exhaled. He walked to the door and opened it. Scout didn't move, didn't flinch, just sat there in the snow, looking up at him with those blue-gray eyes. Ethan crouched down. "Your mom's all right," he said, his voice rough. "She's tough." Scout blinked. Then, slowly, the small bobcat stood and padded toward the trees. But before disappearing, he did something unexpected. He turned back, watching Ethan for a long moment before slipping into the darkness. Ethan swallowed hard. Something was coming, and he wasn't sure if any of them would survive it. Ethan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the poacher's smirk, the rifle in his hands, the blood-stained trap. His gut told him this wasn't over. That man had been confident, too confident. He wasn't afraid of getting caught. Ethan knew the type. Men like him didn't set traps for survival or food. They did it for sport, for money, for the thrill of watching something suffer. By sunrise, Ethan was already up, coffee in hand, eyes scanning the tree line. His phone sat on the counter, but there was no response yet from the wildlife enforcement officers. Maybe they were slow, maybe they didn't care, or maybe they were already stretched too thin covering an area this remote. Either way, he knew one thing: he was on his own. A rustling near the porch made him tense. Instinctively, his hand went to the hunting knife strapped to his belt. But when he turned, it wasn't the poacher. It was Scout. The small bobcat stood just a few feet away, ears flicking, tail twitching slightly in the cold morning air. There was something different in his posture today, something hesitant. Ethan frowned. "What is it, buddy?" Scout didn't move closer. Instead, he turned his head toward the woods. Ethan followed his gaze. The trees were too still. No wind, no birds, no movement. His gut twisted. Something was wrong. He set his coffee down, grabbed his rifle, and stepped off the porch. Scout stayed put, watching as Ethan moved carefully toward the tree-line. His boots crunched in the snow, the only sound in the eerie silence. He scanned the ground for tracks, and that's when he saw them. More footprints. More than one person this time. His grip tightened around his rifle. The tracks led deeper into the forest, in the same direction where he had freed Dakota from the trap. His jaw clenched. Were they looking for her? He moved quickly now, following the tracks, his breath misting in the freezing air. The deeper he went, the heavier the sense of dread became. Then he smelled it, the metallic tang of blood. His heart pounded as he stepped into a small clearing. And there, in the snow, was a fresh deer carcass. Slaughtered, but not butchered. This wasn't a kill for food. It was bait, a trap. A movement to his left made him whip around, rifle raised. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. The poacher. But this time he wasn't alone. Another man stood beside him, older, wearing a thick brown coat and holding a shotgun casually over his shoulder. "Morning," the older man said, voice smooth, almost amused. "You lost." Ethan didn't lower his rifle. "This is my land." The poacher he had seen before smirked. "And yet, here we are." Ethan's eyes flicked back to the deer carcass, then to the shotgun resting too casually in the older man's hands. "Game wardens are on their way," Ethan lied. The smirk didn't fade. "That's so?" The older man took a step forward. "You see, out here, things have a way of getting lost in the snow. Tracks disappear. People disappear." Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He wasn't stupid. These men weren't just poachers. They were killers. He didn't move, didn't breathe. The wrong word, the wrong twitch, and they would pull the trigger. Then, from somewhere behind him, a low, rumbling growl. The tension snapped. Ethan turned just in time to see Dakota step out from the trees. Her golden eyes burned with something primal, something that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was ready to fight. The younger poacher took a step back. "What the hell?" Dakota snarled. A deep, guttural sound that sent both men tensing, their grips tightening on their guns. Ethan didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle. "You should go," he said, his voice cold. "Now." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in the older man's eyes. He glanced at Dakota, then back at Ethan. Then, with a slow smirk, he lowered his shotgun. "We'll see each other again." Without another word, they turned and disappeared into the trees. Ethan didn't move until the sound of their footsteps faded completely. Only then did he lower his rifle, his pulse still hammering. Dakota watched him for a long moment, then turned and limped back into the woods. Scout appeared beside him again, staring up at him with those strange, knowing eyes. Ethan exhaled. This wasn't over. Not even close. And next time, he might not be so lucky. Ethan knew he had only bought himself time. The poachers weren't the kind of men to walk away from a challenge. They were the kind to come back with a plan, and next time they wouldn't just be watching. He spent the rest of the day reinforcing his cabin. He double-checked the locks, barricaded the back windows, and made sure his rifle was loaded. Montana was a place where law and survival blurred. The nearest sheriff's office was miles away, and even if the game wardens took his report seriously, they wouldn't get here in time if things turned violent. He was on his own. By nightfall, the forest was deathly still. No wind.
No distant howls.
Even the owls had gone silent. He sat in the dark, his rifle resting across his lap, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. He wasn't waiting to see if they would come back. He was waiting to see when a sound broke the silence. Not human footsteps, not snapping branches, something softer. He turned his head slowly. Through the frost-covered window, he saw a shadow move. Then another. Small, sleek, low to the ground. Bobcats. Dakota was back. She stood at the edge of the tree line, her golden eyes glowing in the dim moonlight. Behind her, the kittens clustered close, Scout among them. They weren't playing this time. They were watching, waiting. A cold realization settled in Ethan's chest. She knew. Somehow, instinctively, she understood what was coming. The enemy wasn't just the cold. It wasn't just starvation. It was men. Ethan stepped outside, his boots crunching in the frozen snow. Dakota didn't move. She just held his gaze, muscles tensed, tail flicking. Then, she did something he hadn't expected. She looked away, not out of submission, not out of fear. She was looking at something else. Ethan followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing but trees, endless and dark. But then movement, just a flicker of shadow, too fast for the untrained eye. But Ethan had spent his life watching, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. A man, standing just beyond the tree-line, watching. A low growl rumbled from Dakota's throat, so deep it vibrated through the frozen air. Ethan slowly lifted his rifle, pressing the stock against his shoulder. The figure didn't move. Not yet, but Ethan could feel it. The hunt had begun. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees. Then, like the snap of a twig, the tension broke. The shadow disappeared. Ethan didn't think. He ran. His boots pounded against the frozen ground as he charged toward the tree-line, rifle raised. He wasn't sure what he was chasing. A man? A ghost? A threat just out of reach? But his instincts screamed at him to follow. He barely registered the bobcats darting alongside him, their bodies low and fast as they slipped through the underbrush. Dakota was leading them. But where? A sudden movement to his left, a blur of motion. Then gunfire. The crack of a rifle shot split the night. Ethan dived behind a fallen log, snow spraying into the air around him as the bullet buried itself into a nearby tree. His pulse pounded in his ears. They were waiting for him. Another shot rang out. This one was closer. He needed to move. Fast. Ethan rolled to his side, lifting his rifle, eyes scanning the trees. He caught the faintest glimpse of a figure slipping between the pines. The same man from before. The same smirk. They weren't just hunting bobcats anymore. They were hunting him. Ethan took a slow, steady breath. The old instincts kicked in. He had spent years tracking animals, moving silently through forests just like this one. He knew how to disappear, how to become a ghost in the trees. The difference was, this time he wasn't the one with the rifle. He moved low, creeping through the snow, keeping his footsteps light. He had no advantage in firepower, but he had something else. And maybe something wilder. A rustle to his right. Not human. Ethan glanced up just in time to see Scout leaping between the trees, his small body silent against the wind. The bobcat stopped on a low branch, eyes fixed ahead. Watching, tracking. Ethan followed his gaze. There. The poacher was moving left, circling, trying to flank. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle. If he fired first, he would be no better than them. But if he hesitated, another shot rang out. Pain ripped through his shoulder. Ethan staggered back, the force nearly knocking him off his feet. His vision blurred, heat blooming where the bullet grazed him. Not a kill shot, a warning, but he was done running. Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. He lifted his rifle, not to shoot, but to signal. A loud crack echoed through the trees as he fired a single shot into the air, and the forest erupted, a blur of fur and claws. Dakota lunged from the shadows, a snarling, golden-eyed force of nature. The poacher barely had time to react before she slammed into him, knocking his rifle from his hands. He screamed, falling backward into the snow. Ethan didn't hesitate. He moved in, kicking the rifle away before the man could grab it. The poacher scrambled, reaching for his belt, but it was too late. A second shadow moved behind him. The young bobcat darted forward, claws flashing. The poacher let out a strangled yell as the animal raked across his arm, tearing into the thick fabric of his coat. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was enough. The man turned and ran. Blood dripped onto the snow as he stumbled into the darkness, crashing through the underbrush. Ethan stood still, breath heaving, shoulder throbbing. Then silence. Dakota watched him, her chest rising and falling, her fur bristling. Scout stood beside her. Ethan exhaled. He should have been afraid. He should have been questioning everything that just happened. Instead, he lowered his rifle. For the first time, he wasn't sure who had saved who. Ethan stood motionless, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps, the cold biting at his exposed skin. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the retreating figure crashing through the underbrush, disappearing into the night. The poacher was gone, for now, but he would be back. They always came back. He exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. The forest was silent again, except for the soft crunch of snow as Dakota shifted beside him. She didn't leave. She didn't disappear into the woods like before. She just stood there, golden eyes locked onto his. Scout, still bristling from the fight, lingered at her side, ears flicking, breath steaming in the cold air. Ethan wasn't sure how long they stared at each other. Seconds? Minutes? But something had changed. He had saved them, and they had saved him. The line between man and beast had blurred. A sharp gust of wind howled through the trees, snapping Ethan back to reality. He needed to get inside before the blood loss and cold caught up to him. With a slow, measured step, he turned and made his way toward the cabin, glancing over his shoulder. Dakota and Scout hadn't moved, but their eyes followed him all the way to the porch. He stepped inside, locking the door behind him. The warmth of the cabin hit him like a wave. He stumbled to the kitchen, dropping his rifle onto the counter before shrugging off his coat. His fingers fumbled as he peeled back the blood-soaked fabric of his flannel shirt. The bullet had only grazed him, painful but not life-threatening. He grabbed a rag, pressing it against the wound, his mind still racing. The poacher had gotten away. That meant he would tell the others. That meant they weren't done. Ethan clenched his jaw, staring at his reflection in the window. He looked like hell, blood-stained, exhausted. His usually sharp eyes clouded with something heavier than fatigue. He was used to living alone, used to relying on himself, but this was different. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He had a responsibility. Not because he had fed them, not because he had helped Dakota escape that trap, but because he had seen the way the poachers hunted. They weren't after food. They weren't even after sport. They wanted trophies. And as long as Dakota and her family were still in these woods, they were in danger. Ethan let out a slow breath, gripping the edge of the sink. He had 3 options. Option 1, pack up and leave. Abandon the cabin, head back to civilization, let nature take its course. But the thought made his stomach churn. Option 2, call the authorities again. But he had no faith that they would do anything. This deep in the wilderness, people like the poachers operated without consequence. His eyes flicked to his rifle. His fingers tightened against the counter. He had been a photographer and observer of the wild. Never a hunter, never a killer. But this wasn't about killing. It was about protecting. A flicker of movement outside caught his attention. He turned to the window, and his breath caught. Dakota was still there. She stood at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the shadows. Scout was with her, along with 2 of the other kittens. They weren't leaving. They were watching, waiting. For him, Ethan didn't know. But as he stared into the darkness, he knew one thing. The poachers weren't finished. And neither was he. Ethan woke to an eerie silence. No wind, no rustling trees, just stillness. His body ached from the events of the night before, but he forced himself up, wincing as the wound in his shoulder protested. He needed to check the perimeter. Stepping outside, he scanned the clearing.
No footprints.
No signs of movement, but the sense of unease never left him. He moved carefully toward the treeline, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The snow was untouched, undisturbed, too quiet. Then he saw them. Not the poachers. The traps. 3, maybe 4 of them scattered just beyond the clearing. Fresh, set overnight. The poachers hadn't tried to kill him last night because they didn't have to. They weren't hunting him. They were hunting Dakota. Ethan's hands curled into fists. He moved quickly, methodically, disabling each trap. The steel snapped shut with sharp, metallic clicks as he crushed the mechanisms under his boot. The anger simmering beneath his skin burned hotter with every one he destroyed. This wasn't over. A sound made him stop cold. A rustling. Close. Too close. Ethan turned sharply, rifle raised, and froze. Scout stood a few feet away, his small frame tense, ears perked forward. He wasn't alone. Dakota was there too, but something was wrong. She was limping. Ethan's breath caught. Not from exhaustion. Not from the old wound. A new injury. Blood trailed behind her in the snow, staining it deep crimson. His stomach dropped. They had shot her. Panic surged in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm, stepping forward. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice low, steady. Dakota let out a slow, heavy breath. Her golden eyes locked onto his. She was hurt, but she was still standing. Scout took a step closer to Ethan, his body language hesitant but not fearful. For the first time, Ethan realized what was happening. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. They had come to him for help. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had spent years photographing nature, watching from the outside, telling himself he was just an observer. But that wasn't true anymore. He had stepped over the line the moment he freed Dakota from that trap. The moment he chose to protect them instead of walking away. Now, there was no going back. He wouldn't let them die here. Not like this. Ethan turned back toward the cabin, motioning for Scout and Dakota to follow. They hesitated, instinct warring with trust. But then, slowly, carefully, they moved. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the windows as the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall. The storm had arrived, faster and fiercer than the forecasts predicted. Ethan stood at the threshold of his cabin, watching the treetops sway violently, the sky an endless swirl of white. The world was closing in. The poachers wouldn't come in this weather. But that didn't mean the danger had passed. Behind him, the room was warm, the fireplace crackling, throwing flickering shadows against the wooden walls. Dakota lay near the fire, her breathing slow but steady. Her wound wasn't as bad as Ethan had feared. A graze, painful but not fatal. The bullet had barely broken the surface, tearing through muscle but missing anything vital. She was lucky. They all were. But luck wouldn't last forever. Scout paced restlessly near the door, his tail twitching. The storm made him uneasy, the wind carrying scents and sounds he didn't understand. Ethan felt the same. He was trapped here with two wild predators, one injured, the other unpredictable. If Dakota decided she didn't want to be here anymore, if she saw him as a threat instead of an ally, it wouldn't matter what he had done for her. She was still a bobcat, but she hadn't attacked. She hadn't left. Ethan sat on the floor a few feet from her, leaning back against the couch, his rifle within reach but untouched. He wasn't afraid of her. Not anymore. He watched as she shifted slightly, her golden eyes flickering open to meet his. There was no fear there, only exhaustion. "You're not supposed to be here," he murmured. Dakota blinked slowly, unbothered. Scout stopped pacing and looked between them, his small frame tense. The bond between mother and cub was still strong, but something had changed. He wasn't just looking to her anymore. He was looking to Ethan, too. Outside, the wind screamed. Ethan barely slept. The storm raged on, shaking the cabin, snow piling high against the windows. He spent most of the night listening, to the wind, to the fire, to the slow, steady breathing of the bobcats. When morning came, the world was buried under 2 feet of snow. The trees were bent under the weight of it, branches snapping in the distance. The poachers wouldn't be out in this, but that didn't mean the danger was gone. Storms were killers, too. He stepped outside, shivering as the cold bit through his layers. His first priority was checking for tracks. If the poachers had tried to return before the worst of the storm hit, their footprints would still be visible. He scanned the tree-line, his breath misting in the frigid air. Nothing. Relief settled in his chest, but it was short-lived. He turned back toward the cabin and saw Scout standing in the doorway, watching him. Not just watching, waiting. The kitten's fur was puffed out against the cold, his tail flicking. He wasn't afraid of Ethan anymore. That much was clear. But there was something else. Something deeper. Ethan had spent his life watching animals, reading their behavior, understanding what they wanted before they even knew it themselves. And in that moment, he understood Scout. He was waiting for Ethan to lead. The realization was strange, unsettling. The bobcats had relied on Dakota to teach them, to guide them through the wild. But now, Scout was looking to him. Ethan sighed, stepping back inside. "You're gonna regret trusting me," he muttered. Scout didn't move. Neither did Dakota. The storm had changed everything. Food was running low. Ethan hadn't planned for guests, especially not two predators with growing appetites. The storm had buried everything under layers of ice and snow, making hunting nearly impossible. He had one last trout left in the freezer. It wouldn't be enough. He stood at the counter, staring at the fish in his hands. Dakota lay curled near the fire, but her ears twitched, tracking his every move. She knew. Ethan sighed and set the trout down. "Fine." He took his knife and cut it into smaller pieces. First, he tossed one toward Scout. The kitten caught it midair, swallowing it whole. Then, hesitantly, he slid another piece toward Dakota. She didn't move at first. She just watched. Then, slowly, she lowered her head and took the food. Ethan exhaled. Trust was dangerous, but right now, it was all they had. The storm began to die down, the howling winds settling into a quiet hum. Ethan sat by the fire, his rifle resting against the arm of the couch, his body sore from lack of sleep. Dakota stretched beside the fireplace, her wound healing, her body regaining strength. And then, for the first time, something changed. Scout, small and wild and fearless, crept closer to Ethan. Not hesitantly, not cautiously, deliberately. He stopped a foot away, staring up at him, those blue-gray eyes filled with something Ethan couldn't quite name. Then, carefully, he curled up at Ethan's side. Ethan stiffened. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. Scout trusted him. Dakota lifted her head, her golden eyes unreadable. She watched them for a long moment, then, slowly, deliberately, she closed her eyes again. Permission. Ethan let out a shaky breath. He lifted his hand, hovering just above Scout's fur. If he touched him, he crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The kitten didn't move. Slowly, Ethan let his fingers brush against the soft fur. Scout purred. Ethan's throat tightened. He closed his eyes. The storm was over, and something else had begun. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in the heavy snow that buried the landscape. The sky was a piercing blue, deceptively calm, as if the chaos of the past few days had never happened. But Ethan knew better. Everything had changed. He felt it in his bones, in the air, in the way Scout no longer hesitated before coming close, in the way Dakota watched him differently now. Ethan stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting at his skin. The world was eerily silent, muffled by the thick layer of fresh snow. He scanned the tree line for any signs of movement. No tracks, no sign of the poachers. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. They weren't the kind of men to give up easily. They were waiting, watching. Behind him, the cabin door creaked as Scout padded out, his small paws barely making a sound on the snow. He had followed Ethan without hesitation, his blue-gray eyes flicking toward the trees, ears twitching, sensing the same unease. Dakota remained inside, resting, her wound healing, but Ethan knew she wouldn't stay much longer. And that was the problem. They were still here, but they weren't supposed to be. Ethan had crossed a line he swore he never would. He had gone from an observer to a participant, from a man studying the wild to a man who had become a part of it. And that terrified him, because now he wasn't sure if he could let go. Ethan knelt in the snow, watching Scout as he sniffed at the frozen ground. The Bobcat moved differently now, more confident, less hesitant. He wasn't the frail, starving kitten Ethan had first seen on his porch. He was growing, learning, adapting. But there was one thing he hadn't learned: how to leave. Ethan let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. He had to end this. Standing, he turned back toward the cabin. Dakota was watching from the doorway. She had seen the shift in Scout, too. She knew what Ethan had done, whether she understood it in human terms or not. And she was waiting for him to fix it. Inside, Ethan packed a small bag, extra food, medical supplies, anything he might need. He pulled on his coat, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and stepped back outside. Scout followed.
No hesitación.
No fear. Ethan's chest tightened. It had to be now. They walked into the forest, Ethan leading the way, Scout trailing close behind. The snow was deep, but the bobcat kept pace, his small body weaving effortlessly through the drifts. Dakota followed at a distance, her eyes sharp, watching but not interfering. This was between Ethan and Scout now. They walked for miles, deeper than Ethan had ever gone before, past the ridges and valleys he knew like the back of his hand. They reached a clearing, wild, untouched, far from the cabin, far from human scent. This was where Scout belonged. Ethan stopped. So did Scout. The kitten's ears twitched, sensing something, some unspoken shift in the air. He looked up at Ethan, tail flicking, eyes questioning. Ethan swallowed hard. "This is it," he murmured. Scout blinked. Ethan took a step back, then another. Scout didn't move. His heart clenched. This was the moment he had dreaded. Another step. Scout's muscles tensed. Then finally he took a step forward, toward Ethan. Not the wild, not the trees. Him. Ethan's throat tightened. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. He shook his head. "Go," he said, firmer this time. Scout hesitated. Then, from behind them, a deep, familiar sound. A chuff. Ethan turned. Dakota stood at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting. She chuffed again. A sound of reassurance. A mother's call. Scout's ears flicked. He turned slightly, eyes darting between them. Then finally he moved. Not toward Ethan. Toward her. The weight in Ethan's chest was unbearable. But he forced himself to stay still, to let it happen. Scout hesitated only once, glancing back. Ethan exhaled, his breath curling in the cold air. And then Scout was gone. Running, leaping, fading into the trees, back where he belonged. Ethan didn't move. Not for a long time. He stood there, staring at the place where the bobcat had disappeared, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. It was over. It had to be. By the time Ethan returned to the cabin, it was nearly dark. The weight in his chest hadn't lessened. If anything, it had settled deeper, like a wound he wasn't sure would ever heal. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. The fire was still burning, casting a soft, golden glow over the cabin walls. It felt empty. That was good. That was right. Then movement outside caught his eye. He turned, heart lurching, but it wasn't Scout. Dakota stood at the edge of the clearing, her golden eyes locked onto his. She had come back. Just for a moment, she watched him, a silent acknowledgement, farewell. Then, as swiftly as she had appeared, she turned and vanished into the trees. This time, Ethan didn't follow. He didn't need to. Some things weren't meant to be chased. Some things had to be let go. Winter loosened its grip on the Montana wilderness, though the remnants of its brutality still lingered in the patches of ice clinging stubbornly to the earth. The days grew longer, the sun a little warmer, but Ethan Walker felt none of it. The cabin was too quiet now. He had spent months in solitude, yet this silence was different. This was absence. Scout was gone. Dakota was gone. And for the first time, Ethan didn't know what to do with himself. He moved through his daily routine like a ghost, chopping firewood, maintaining his rifle, checking for tracks around the property. But there were no fresh bobcat prints in the snow, no blue-gray eyes peering curiously through the window. The wild had reclaimed them, as it should, yet some part of him ached. He told himself this was what he wanted, what he had always planned. He had come out here to escape, to disappear, to live without attachments. But he had made one anyway, and now he was left behind. Days passed, then weeks. The snow melted, the river thawed. Spring took hold of the land and life returned. Birds nested in the trees, deer wandered closer to the cabin, cautious but no longer deterred by the remnants of winter. Ethan knew the world had moved on, and he tried to do the same. But then, on a cold April morning, he saw it. A single track, small, precise, set apart from the others in the muddy ground just beyond the tree line. His breath caught. He knew that shape. Bobcat. Ethan crouched down, pressing his palm lightly beside the print. It was fresh, hours old at most. His pulse quickened. Was it Scout? He followed the tracks deeper into the woods, his steps cautious, measured. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the trees, searching, hoping. But after a mile, the trail disappeared into the undergrowth, fading into the vast wilderness. Ethan stood still for a long time, staring at the spot where the tracks ended. He had expected disappointment, but instead he felt something else. Peace. Scout was alive, thriving, and that was enough. That evening, Ethan sat by the fire, staring at the empty chair across from him. He had spent so much time observing, capturing fleeting moments through a camera lens, but he had never been a part of the story. Until now, the world needed to know, not about him, not about what he had done, but about Scout, about Dakota, about the fight to protect creatures like them. Ethan grabbed his notebook and began to write. He wrote about the moment he found Scout, about the days spent watching Dakota, about the night the poachers almost took everything from them. He wrote about trust and fear, about instinct and survival, about the fine line between kindness and interference. And as the words filled the pages, he felt something lift. This was how he could honor them, not by keeping them, but by telling their story. Weeks passed. Ethan sent his writing to a conservation magazine, unsure if they would care, if anyone would even read it. He expected silence. Instead, they responded with a single question. Do you have photos? Ethan almost laughed. Did he have photos? He had hundreds. He sent them in, then went about his days expecting nothing. But one afternoon, as he walked along the ridge near his cabin, something caught his eye. A figure, small but strong, watching him from a distance. He froze. The fur was thicker, the body leaner, the muscles stronger. But the eyes were the same, blue-gray. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Scout. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Scout took a step forward. Not toward him, not toward the cabin, just closer. Ethan didn't move, didn't even blink. He knew that if he did, the moment would break. Scout stared at him for a long time. Recognition. And then, just as silently as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Ethan exhaled, his chest tight, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. Somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of the wilderness, Scout was still running. And he always would be. Ethan's article was published. His photos spread online. Conservationists praised the story, while others debated whether he had done the right thing by interfering. Some called him reckless. Some called him a hero. Ethan didn't care about any of that. He had never done it for recognition. He had done it because it mattered. Months later, as he stepped out onto his porch, feeling the warmth of summer in the air, he glanced at the tree line out of habit. No bobcats, no tracks, but that was okay. Somewhere out there, Scout was living his life, and Ethan had finally found his own.